Bom, agora que já está gravando, então vamos oficialmente começar o seminário da programação de seminários do programa de pós-graduação em Ciência Política da USP. Boa tarde, ou quase boa noite a todos e todas. É um prazer hoje contar com o professor Daniel Gingerich, da Universidade da Virgínia, que vai apresentar um seminário resultante de um paper que foi publicado recentemente na American Political Science Review. Vou apresentar brevemente o professor Daniel, antes de passar a palavra para ele. Para quem não me conhece, né, importante falar isso também, para quem não me conhece, eu sou o Danilo, sou pós-doutorando do SEBRAP, também visto vários chapéus, como pós-doc no Brasil, a gente sempre usa vários chapéus. Eu também sou pesquisador colaborador do Centro de Estudos em Opinião Pública da Unicamp, e atualmente também sou pesquisador do Núcleo de Estudos Comparados Internacionais da USP, o NECI, e atualmente estou lecionando uma disciplina no Departamento de Ciência Política, uma disciplina na pós-graduação. Então é um grande prazer estar oferecendo essa disciplina e estar participando mais ativamente do Departamento de Ciência Política da USP esse semestre. Bom, apresentar o professor Daniel, antes de passar a palavra para ele. O professor Daniel atua na Universidade da Virgínia desde 2007, sendo que desde 2014 como professor associado. Na mesma instituição, ele é diretor do Quantitative Collaborative, um centro de pesquisa projetado para disseminar novos avanços nas ciências sociais quantitativas e também promover uma maior colaboração interdisciplinar. Além disso, ele é co-diretor do Corruption Laboratory for Ethics, Accountability and the Rule of Law, também na Universidade da Virgínia. Daniel é doutor em Government, ou, por falta de melhor tradução, Ciência Política pela Universidade de Harvard, e foi pós-doutorando no Center for the Study of Democratic Politics em Princeton. E também foi pesquisador visitante no Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento. Seu livro, Political Institutions and Party-Directed Corruption in South America, Stealing for the Team, já é um clássico aqui no Departamento de Ciência Política da USP, sendo incluído no programa de vários cursos de política comparada do departamento. Importante destacar que em 2014 a obra recebeu menção honrosa no prêmio de melhor livro da seção de Economia Política da American Political Science Association. Este ano, Daniel também recebeu o prêmio de melhor artigo em política comparada da APSA pelo trabalho Ballot Reform as Suffrage Restriction, Evidence from Brazil's Second Republic. E tá aí um termo que talvez o professor Fernando vai brigar com o Daniel, porque tem essa discussão se é Second ou Third Republic. Eu sei que tem um pessoal aqui do departamento que também vai implicar com o Daniel com esse subtítulo. Mas, brincadeiras à parte, é um excelente trabalho que foi premiado esse ano. Bom, para encerrar, de forma geral, sua pesquisa analisa os fatores que influenciam a capacidade do Estado e a qualidade de governança democrática na América Latina e no Caribe. Seu trabalho busca elucidar as causas e consequências da corrupção e do clientelismo na região, e suas publicações, de forma geral, abarcam questões de governança, design institucional, política partidária, teoria formal aplicada e metodologia política. Hoje o professor, então, Daniel, apresentará o seu trabalho recentemente publicado na American Political Science Review, Buying Power. O professor Daniel vai dar o seminário em inglês, mas ele também fala português, então vocês podem enviar as perguntas em português, que no Q&A eu leio as perguntas e, enfim, depois que o professor Daniel fizer a sua apresentação, também vou colocar alguns comentários. É isso, turma, e Daniel, muito obrigado por ter aceito o convite, por estar aqui conosco hoje. A palavra está com você. Obrigado. Ótimo seminário a todos e todas.
Thank you so much, Janela, for that very, very kind introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here at the University of Sao Paulo, albeit virtually, of course. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you and just make sure that everyone can see my slides. How do those look? Does that look good to everybody? Just give me a thumbs up. Great. So before going into the details of this presentation, I should say that this article has an intimate connection with the University of Sao Paulo, the Department of Political Science at the University of Sao Paulo. So I'm I'm delighted to be presenting it here. The last time I was at USP was in person several years ago, and it was part of a research trip that was coming out of a project between Fernando Limongi and I, which was a grant supported by the University of Virginia and FABESP that resulted in a conference. And during my visit to Brazil, I spent a week here virtually. I spent a week at the University of Sao Paulo, and then after that, I spent time at the CBDoc archives in Rio de Janeiro. And so this paper that you're seeing today came out of that experience, that archival visit several years ago. So it's really a delight to present this work to you today. So as Danilo mentioned, title of this presentation is Buying Power, Electoral Strategy Before the Secret Vote. So I thought I would start with giving you a little bit of background within the discipline of political science on the development of the literature on clientelism, and then a little bit of background in terms of my own research trajectory, so you can get a sense of where this article fits in into a larger body of work that I have been producing on clientelism and vote brokerage in Brazil. So if you go back almost 20 years ago now, there's an early wave of research where political science was rediscovering topics like clientelism and vote buying, which had fallen off of the radar in comparative politics really since the 1960s and 1970s. So you get this initial wave of research on clientelism. And there's many important contributions. Leonard Blanchgestein's randomized control trial executed in Benin, the conceptual work by Kitschult and Wilkinson in their edited volume. But it's really sort of the 2005 APSR piece by Susan Stokes, which I think really puts clientelism back firmly on the radar of comparativists during this period of time. However, in this initial early generation of research on clientelism, the organizational structure of clientelism was really still pretty thin. So sort of the theoretical understanding of how clientelistic exchange was structured and the different sets of actors that were involved in clientelistic exchange, that was not as fully fleshed out as perhaps it could have been. And so very soon after that initial body of work on clientelism came to the fore, then a subsequent literature developed which turned its attention specifically to the role of vote brokers, okay? Vote brokers being intermediaries whose job it is to bring out the vote, to bring out blocks of voters on behalf of the politician or the political party that has contracted for their services, right? I'm talking about sort of the concept of vote brokers to a Brazilian audience as if that's new, right? Of course, you know, within Brazilian sociological work and historiography, you know, work on vote brokerage goes back to the late 1940s, if not earlier, right? Clearly, there's an understanding of the importance of vote brokerage. But within I'm talking about within the theoretical literature and comparative politics, it's actually a fairly new topic that you see emerging in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And so I, like many others, have turned my attention to work on vote brokerage and have dedicated myself to understanding the structure of vote brokerage and how it relates to political institutions. And in particular, my recent work has used the historical and contemporary experience of Brazil to address 4 questions which I think are central to this literature. The first is, are vote brokers still effective in mobilizing votes in the contemporary secret ballot era? And that's a question that I first addressed in an article in QJPS in 2014, looking at variation in the state of Minas Gerais and exploiting information coming out of the Mensalão Mineiro scandal. A second question, which I worked on with a then colleague, Luis Fernando Medina, which is what explains the survival and decay of vote brokerage under the secret ballot? And we developed a theoretical framework to try to address that question.
Daniel,
yep.
Daniel, sorry to interrupt you, but I guess we are still seeing the first slide. I don't know if there is an issue.
Oh,
did you
really?
change slides? Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure why that is. I'm not. I'm not sure why that is. I'm not seeing that.
Oh, now, yes. Now we are seeing the third slide, brokers in Brazil.
Got it. Okay, yeah, I just can't put it on full screen. That's what happens.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No,
so here
okay.
we are. This is, this is the correct slide. Thank you, Danilo, for interrupting me on that. And so the third question that I focused on in my research is, how did the adoption of the effective secret ballot, so this is taking these questions in the direction of history, how did the adoption of the effective secret ballot shape vote brokerage and democratic participation more generally? It's a question which I addressed in the 2019 AJPS article that Danilo mentioned earlier, as well as Danilo should mention a co-authored article that he and I recently published in CPS also addresses this question. So finally, this paper that I'm presenting today asks a fourth question in this broader literature on brokers, which is, how does the labor market for brokers work, right? So how are brokers compensated, and how are they held accountable to the individuals who utilize their services, who pay them to bring out the vote on their behalf? Okay. So let me give you sort of an outline of this article, and then I'll go into the theory and empirics. So in essence, in employing brokers, politicians face a selection problem, right? So in any given campaign, they have potentially many brokers to choose from, right? Many brokers that could mobilize votes on their behalf, but they have a limited campaign budget, right? So they have limited resources that they can allocate to the machines of different brokers who are going to be embedded in different parts of a geographical space, right? So for federal deputies, they'll be embedded in different municipalities in a particular state that the federal deputy is competing in, right? So in that case, the question, the challenge that's faced by the politician is relatively easy to state, right? Each politician has to choose the level of investment, if any, that they're going to make in the machine of each broker that they could potentially cultivate, right? So it's essentially a resource allocation problem. It's often claimed in the literature on brokerage today that this type of selection is driven by learning, right? In particular, learning by politicians about brokers' intrinsic ability to mobilize voters. The problem is that the existing evidence in the literature for this proposition is pretty indirect, and it's subject to debate. It's indirect because a lot of these papers don't use anything approaching a direct measure of clientelistic exchange, and they typically don't have direct measures of the allocation of campaign resources to brokers either, right? So there hasn't been a lot of data that directly speaks to this question. So what this article does is it uses a hand-coded data set, which is based on the archives of Gustavo Campanema, who, as many of you surely know, was a mid-20th century congressman from Minas Gerais, Brazil, after the period in which he served as one of the most powerful ministers of health and then education under Getulio Vargas. So using the archives of Campanema, which are really an exceptional resource that I'll describe during this presentation, this paper does two things. First, it provides the first direct evidence that learning drives politicians, investments, and brokers. And based on the information in the archives, we can actually observe learning in a very direct way, which I think is a unique contribution of this paper. Second, the paper is able to actually estimate the electoral returns to spending on brokers during the pre-secret ballot era. In fact, I estimate that during this period of time, when campaign spending was allocated to brokers, you would get roughly 1 vote for every $14 spent, or at least Campanema got roughly 1 vote for every $14 spent, and these dollars are in 1990 dollars. So as I'll describe at the end of my presentation, that's actually very efficient use of campaign funds. The allocation of money today to try to cultivate voters is much less efficient. And even if we look at other historical examples of vote buying in pre-secret ballot eras in different contexts, buying votes used to be much more expensive. So purchasing brokers in Brazil during this period of time was actually a pretty efficient way to mobilize voters. So let me talk about how this work fits into the existing literature on brokers and politicians in comparative politics. So broadly speaking, there's 2 strands of research on this topic. The largest strand by far analyzes brokers' relationships with their voters. And so here the emphasis is in sort of explaining what makes for successful or unsuccessful vote brokers. So there's a lot of work that focuses on the information about citizens that's held by vote brokers, the role of the economic vulnerability of citizens, brokers' access to state resources, their capacity to solve problems for their clients, and their embeddedness in social networks. So an extensive literature looks at these different dimensions of what makes brokers effective or not. But there's another strand, not quite as large yet, but is growing, which looks at brokers' relationships with their patrons, okay? That means the politicians or the political parties that are contracting their services. And this paper falls squarely in that second category, okay? And so one of the problems that has been focused on in this literature has been the issue of mitigating opportunism, right? How is it that politicians or parties are able to keep vote brokers from just accepting their resources and pocketing them and not really using them effectively to mobilize voters? A second issue, and this issue is of central concern for this paper, is the issue of selection, right? How is it that politicians or parties are able to select good, meaning high ability types, high ability brokers via learning? How are they able to do that? Are they able to do it effectively in elections? And so there's a variety of work that suggests that indeed politicians are able to do that, and they do that in a variety of countries around the world by exploiting particular performance metrics of the efficacy of vote brokers in mobilizing voters. And in this regard, there's been a lot of emphasis played on the role of aggregate electoral returns, sometimes at the precinct level, sometimes at larger aggregations. Some work has focused on the importance of mobilizing voters through participation in rallies. In particular, work coming out of Argentina has emphasized that. So we see evidence of the use of these types of performance metrics to learn about the efficacy of vote brokers in studies in countries such as Argentina, but also Liberia, Mexico, and Senegal. Horacio Lagari in particular has done a lot of work sort of emphasizing the importance of decentralized monitoring of this sort. But he's not by any stretch alone in this literature. So what I'll suggest to you is that that's terrific. But prior to this paper that I'm presenting here, my argument is that we hadn't really quite clinched the case that politicians used aggregate measures of broker performance to hold them accountable and to learn about their efficacy, because we didn't have the right data. In particular, I would submit to you that clinching the case for learning requires data that provides information about politicians' expectations of performance by different vote brokers, measures of the realized performance of those vote brokers, how did they actually perform, right? And then thirdly, really important, evidence on changes in the investments in brokers over time as a function of the deviation between those initial expectations and the actual performance of those brokers, right? That would be, you know, if we had data of that type, that would be a hard test of the argument that politicians are learning over time about the efficacy of brokers using these aggregate measures. Okay. So let me go quickly through sort of the context here in which this article is situated. You all will know the context pretty well. So what I'm looking at here are elections in mid-20th century Brazil, in particular I'm going to be looking at rural Minas Gerais during the late 1950s and early 1960s. This is still a period of time in which elections are being contested under the Cédula Avulsa, which is Brazil's candidate printed ballot system. It is the ballot system which existed prior to the introduction of the Cédula Oficial, which is the Australian ballot system, which is the system that gave birth to the numeric voting system with which you are all familiar today. Prior to the introduction of the Cédula Oficial, essentially candidates would distribute ballots with their names and their party on it and the office on it. Those ballots, which they had to pay for themselves to have printed, were invariably distributed by local vote brokers at the municipal level. So candidates for federal and state office had to make deals with vote brokers, and these folks were often mayors, not always mayors, but they were often mayors or candidates for mayor. And those individuals then would distribute the ballots for the higher level politician, the federal deputy or the senator or whoever it was, and they would use their cabos electorais, their local machinery in the municipality to try to guarantee that the politician who paid for their services would have a good showing at the ballot box. Okay. It is not an exaggeration to say that without some vote broker distributing ballots and physically transporting voters to the polls, it was basically impossible to receive votes in many rural areas during this period of time under this given electoral technology, right? You just didn't have a way for voters to vote for you unless there was somebody putting the ballots in the hands of your voters and transporting them to the polls on your behalf. And the data, that I'll show in a moment is pretty consistent with this idea. So this is an image of sort of a particularly well-known vote broker, Chico Heraclio, who's actually not from Minas Gerais, who's the well-known boss of Limoeiro and Pernambuco during this period of time, just to sort of give a sense of who some of these figures were. So not surprisingly, given the importance of local vote brokers and bringing out the vote during this period of time at the municipal level, these brokers then could pretty easily be evaluated by the votes that they mobilized for their candidates, just by checking how that candidate did in the municipality, right? The candidates are going to then look at the number of votes they got in each municipality, and they could get a sense of how the broker is doing. They could monitor this very, very easily, because every candidate, if they were paying attention, knew how many of the candidate printed ballots they actually sent to the different brokers in the different municipalities where they were trying to get votes. So it was very easy to evaluate the performance of one's vote brokers during this period of time, especially in rural areas. It was a little more complicated in urban areas. In some highly literate areas like Sao Paulo, politicians could pay newspapers to put their ballots into the newspaper, and voters in theory could cut those out and then use them to vote, in which case you wouldn't need necessarily a vote broker to vote. But in more rural areas of Brazil during this time, that just was not an option. And so if you didn't have a vote broker distributing a ballot to you, you were not likely to vote for that particular politician. So this is the ballot technology, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. This comes from the Campanema Archives. That's the ballot that Campanema used in the federal deputy elections of 1954 in Minas Gerais. There were sort of strict rules on what the ballots had to look like, so they looked almost the same for all politicians. They had to be a certain size, they had to be on paper of a certain opacity, and they had to have the office, the politician, and the party that he or she represented. So let me talk a little bit about the archive that's based, the archive that I get the data for this paper from, which is the Gustavo Campanema Archive held at CP-DOC. Campanema, as you know, was a highly influential legislator for the state of Minas Gerais. He was a federal deputy from 45 to 1970, and so he won re-election 6 consecutive times. He was very good at what he did. He was very good in cultivating and monitoring vote brokers. And in fact, after winning re-election 6 times as federal deputy, he finished his career then in the Senate. He was also, he also was a descendant of Brazilian nobility, a very powerful minister of state. So he was a very well-networked and well-resourced politician as well. He was a leading member of the right-leaning, rural-based Social Democratic Party, which, the PSD being the party during this period of time that perhaps was most strongly and popularly associated with coronelismo and vote brokerage in the countryside. So Campanema's election papers, which are held at CP-DOC, are really a terrific resource. I recommend anybody who's interested in this topic to give them a good look. They provide an unparalleled view of the process of negotiating and purchasing the support of rural vote brokers. They run thousands of pages and contain many different letters and telegrams, which document in pretty explicit ways the nature of exchange between Campanema and his campaign and vote brokers in a whole host of municipalities throughout Minas Gerais. This is not the type of thing that would likely be made public today, but we're able to get a really good sense of how brokerage worked through this lens of history. So again, exchanges and notes between Campanema, brokers in Minas Gerais, as well as Campanema's campaign staff. And in particular, it has records which are extremely rare and I think really interesting that are exploited in this paper, which are detailed records of his campaign expenditures across multiple elections, right? Campaign expenditures targeted to different brokers in different municipalities, as well as Campanema's vote tallies across municipalities. And not just his vote tallies, his expectations about vote tallies, right? Given his exchanges with vote brokers. So let me just give you a sense of, the nature of exchange that's captured in some of these documents. to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about here. There were actually plenty of direct exchanges of money for blocks of votes, especially in the 58 and 62 elections. There were also exchanges earlier on, in 54, which were kind of public works exchanges as well. That was part of the mix. But really, as you head into the 58 and 62 elections, there's a lot of just straightforward exchanges of money being sent to brokers in their machines in exchange for blocks of votes. So this is a quote that comes out of a document which was provided by a campaign worker to Campanema. This campaign worker went to a variety of different municipalities where there were mayors that were still up for grabs, mayors that had not yet allied themselves to a particular federal deputy politician. And this campaign worker came up with a list of the mayors, essentially the number of votes they controlled, and roughly speaking, the price that they were going to charge Campanema to bring out that block of votes for him. So in a particular case, the campaign worker writes, the mayor, Sebastião Costa y Silva, and Mr. Rafael G. Simoni, they run the PSD in the municipality of Gloria, and they guarantee 200 votes. The parties there have formed a coalition, and there's only one candidate for mayor. Mr. Sebastião Costa y Silva requests a financial contribution. The term that's used is uma ajuda financiera. If that's possible, if you're favorably inclined, send the check via Banco Itaú to the branch in São João Batista do Glória. Okay, so this is dated, this letter is dated September 24th, 1958. Campanema indeed went ahead and purchased the support of that mayor. And we know that without doubt because he wrote next to this quote in the document, 20,000 cruceros, but even sort of more explicitly, he included the bank deposit receipt. He actually had the bank deposit receipt in the archives themselves. So 3 pages later, we see the deposit in the account that was mentioned for favoring this particular mayor in Banco Itaú in São João Batista do Glória, right? And precisely the amount that was asked for. So you get a sense of how this worked. More systematically, we have detailed tables of expenditures for the 58 and 62 elections based on tables created by Campanema, recording his expenditures on the municipal machines of the brokers, right? So he listed the municipality, the individual to whom the money was spent, the amount of money in cruceros that was spent, and we have that for both 1958 and 1962. So we're able to see how expenditures to different municipalities are changing over time, okay? So this is going to be the basis of the campaign spending data that's used in this paper. In addition to this really rich data on campaign expenditures, Campanema also produced for multiple elections tables of his expected and actual votes. Okay, so he did this for 3 election cycles where he created tables recording his expected votes in each municipality, the amount of votes that he actually got, and then he actually recorded the deviation, right, in his notes between what he expected to get and what he actually got, right? So how much he expected to get, and did he get more or did he get less, and by how much? And I want to draw your attention to these sort of numbered circles. So you'll see sort of certain municipalities are highlighted there, and there's a number and a circle. Often that's referencing back to notes in the archives where he's discussing the broker that he has some exchange with, and sometimes the details of the exchange, or how many candidate printed ballots had been allocated to that particular individual and that particular municipality, right? So it's clear that the expectations that he had for those municipalities in terms of the number of votes he was supposed to get was a function of the exchanges that he had with those vote brokers, because they are explicitly referenced in the archives. Okay, and so these tables of actual and expected votes are the basis of the electoral data that are used in this article. And in particular, the paper uses deviations between expectations and actual votes, whether actual votes were greater than expected or less, to assess the importance of learning about brokers' ability, right? If the brokers do better than you expected, then yeah, now they're more effective than you anticipated. If they did worse than expected, you've learned they're less effective than you anticipated. So here's just a graph, and I have to thank Danilo here. Danilo was my excellent research assistant for this paper, and he produced this graph that you see here. I want you to take something simple but important out of this graph, which is to say there's quite a bit of volatility in the number of votes that Campanema gets in particular municipalities over time. And that volatility is not sort of compatible with either voting based primarily on ideological allegiance to the candidate, or even sort of voting based on personal affinity to the candidate, right? So it was not uncommon to see municipalities that would provide, let's say, several hundred votes for him, or even like 1,000 votes for him in one election, suddenly going to 0 in a subsequent election, or some municipalities that had 0 votes effectively for Campanema in one election, having then several hundred votes for him in subsequent elections. In my mind, that's consistent with this point that I'm making, which is during this period of time, actually having an exchange with a vote broker and a broker distributing ballots could mean the difference between literally having no presence in a municipality and having a pretty substantial chunk of votes coming out of that municipality. So there's a theoretical framework which undergirds the paper, which is based on a principal agent model, a 2-period model with incomplete contracts. This model generates the specific hypotheses that are tested with data in the paper. Let me go over this pretty quickly, and I'll give you sort of the key intuitions of the model. Essentially, there's a politician who employs 2 different vote brokers, right? You can think about the brokers as the 2 options that politician has in terms of allocating resources. Each of those brokers are embedded in jurisdictions. We can think about them as municipalities in the Brazilian case. And within those jurisdictions, the vote brokers are solely responsible for mobilizing votes on behalf of the politician. So in each period, the politician's votes in a given jurisdiction are a function of his payment to the broker, right? The more that the politician invests in the municipality, the more money the politician spends on the broker's machine, right? Again, these brokers are often mayoral candidates, so the federal deputy is investing in those machines. The higher, in theory, the politician's votes should be. Also, the politician's votes are a function of the broker's effort. So the more effort being expended by the broker, the higher the politician's votes should be. The politician's votes are also a function of the broker's ability, and they're a function of random noise, right? The trick here is that the politician observes his payment to the broker, but he does not observe the broker's effort directly, nor does he observe the broker's ability. Okay, that is not directly observable by the politician, right? So he needs to try to learn who are the most highly effective vote brokers, and he's going to want to allocate his resources as a function of what he learns. So 2 basic comparative statics come from this model. First is this idea of the optimal recalibration of campaign spending, right? The model shows that electoral payments to brokers in future elections increase with positive deviations from expected performance in current elections, and they decrease with negative deviations. Again, this is really simple, right? If a vote broker does better than I expected, then I'm going to shower him with more resources in a subsequent election because I know that's a more efficient way to spend my money. I know he's good at what he does, right? If the vote broker does worse than I expected, then I'm going to reduce my campaign expenditures on his machine in subsequent elections. The second comparative static is more subtle, but it makes, I think, perfect sense, which is there should also be some reputational conditionality here, right? Which is the elasticity of future payments to current deviations from expectations should be weaker for brokers for whom the politician has strongly favorable priors about ability. So the way to think about this is you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? If you know, based upon past performance, that a vote broker is effective because in previous elections, that vote broker has a record of bringing out the vote for you, you're not going to punish him overwhelmingly for one bad performance. So if that vote broker just did poorly in the last election, but in previous elections, he did a good job bringing out the vote for you, then you're not going to punish him as strongly for that one bad showing as you would a vote broker who doesn't have a strong previous record, okay? So there's going to be this elasticity, right? If in earlier elections, there's going to be this conditional relationship where if in earlier elections, a vote broker brought out the vote for you, if he didn't do so well in the last election, you're not going to punish him as strongly as you would if he wasn't effective based on his previous record, okay? Again, that's completely consistent with the theory of learning. So let me tell you a little bit about how I structured the empirics. It's very simple regression analyses here, but analyses that exploit the temporal variation in this data as well as the geographical variation. So there's going to be both a non-interactive and an interactive model that are evaluated. The dependent variable is the change in spending in the municipality from 1958 to 1962, right? It's not a level, it's the change, right? So how much is Gustavo Campanema changing the proportion of his total budget that he's allocating in a given municipality from 58 to 1962? And that's going to be a function of the deviation between the actual and expected votes in 1958. So in the 58 election, did the municipality do better or worse than Campanema expected? It's also going to be a function of, in the interactive model, the number of votes received by Campanema in that municipality in 1958, right? So in the non-interactive model, we're just testing the effect of deviation, right? Conditional on a set of political and demographic covariates. In the interactive model, we're estimating the effect of that deviation from expectations, but we're also estimating the interaction between a previous record of success by the broker in that municipality and deviation in 1958, right? So as you'll recall, the optimal recalibration comparative static is going to imply that the coefficient on the deviation variable, tau, should be positive, whereas the reputational conditionality comparative static implies that the coefficient on the interactive term, the interaction between deviations in 1958 and votes in 1954, that interactive term should be negative. Okay, and so those are the expectations that we go into with the empirical analysis. So here's the central table of the paper. This shows the change over time in the proportion of spending allocated to a municipality. I also analyze here changes in the raw amount of spending, and the results are very similar. So across the board, deviations in expectations are very, very strongly statistically significantly associated with changes in campaign expenditures. So brokers who do better than Campanema expected get more resources in subsequent elections, and brokers who did worse than expected get fewer resources in subsequent elections. Moreover, this conditional relationship holds as well. So the impact of deviation from expectations is not as great in those municipalities where brokers were really effective in earlier elections, in particular the 1954 election, right? So the impact of deviations from expectations is not as great in those cases, in which case we have a negative sign on the interactive effect. And these results are really robust. They hold irrespective of specific specifications of the covariate set. You can have no covariates, you can have a limited set of covariates, a really rich set of political and economic covariates, and those results do not change. So here you just to get a sense of the conditional relationship between deviations from expectations and previous levels of support for Campanema. In those municipalities where Campanema's support in 1954 was not particularly high, deviations from expectations in 1958 was a huge driver of changes in the investment of campaign resources from 58 to 1962, right? You clearly see that here. You know, looking at municipalities that had less than 100 votes of support for Campanema in 54, or more than 100 votes of support for Campanema in 1954. But if those municipalities had high support, more than 100 votes for Campanema in 1954, the relationship, while still positive, is not nearly as strong, right? And here in the second graph, I use 250 votes as sort of the threshold for significant support for Campanema, and the same type of relationship holds. It's even more visible, right? Where in those municipalities where Campanema had in 1954 less than 250 votes in support of him, deviations in 1958 was a huge driver of his change in campaign spending in that municipality from 58 to 62. But if he didn't have, but in places where rather he had a lot of support already in 1954, those deviations in 1958 were not much of a driver of changes in spending. So the point here is that the impact of deviation was strongly conditioned on past vote counts, and precisely the way the model leads one to expect. The impact of deviations is smaller for municipal machines with high past vote counts, and greater in municipal machines with low past vote counts. So now finally, I'm going to get to something which is, I think, really crucial here, which is electoral returns to spending, right? Not only is the paper able to show that spending reflected learning about the relative efficacy of vote brokers, we're able to actually in this paper estimate the returns to spending on brokers on actual votes. In particular, we can estimate how much it costs to buy votes by purchasing vote brokers. So here the paper uses a first difference approach. The outcome is the overtime difference in Campanema's votes in a given municipality from 1958 to 1962. And the key explanatory variable is the difference in raw spending, which of course is corrected for inflation, which was non-trivial during this period of time, on a given municipal machine over the same time period, over the 58 to 62 time period. So we're looking at differences in spending, right? Raw spending in a municipality from 58 to 62, and our outcome is differences in votes in a given municipality for Campanema. So the model's conditioned on a wide set of political and demographic covariates. And I'm not going to show you this here, but I also use placebo regressions, looking at prior vote shifts as an outcome to assess the plausibility of the identification strategy that undergirds this analysis, the identification strategy being parallel paths. To make a long story short, that analysis suggests that the identification strategy is valid and makes sense in this context. So looking at the impact of spending on brokers on votes, there's a positive and statistically significant relationship across the board, irrespective of the particular specification of the model. These results are statistically significant at any reasonable threshold of statistical significance. And again, to put these into sort of layman terms, essentially what I find here is that Campanema was spending roughly $14 and $19.90 for each vote that he bought by purchasing vote brokers. So that suggests to me that there's a pretty high level of productivity of expenditures on vote brokers, and I'll tell you why. He's getting 25 votes for each 10,000 cruceros spent. Again, that's $14 US per vote. By historical comparison, the only other study that I found that tries to estimate the cost of buying votes in a pre-secret ballot era comes from a study by Christopher Cam, published in CPS in 2017. And he reports the cost of buying votes in 1868 in Great Britain. This was prior to the advent of the secret vote in that country. He reports a cost of about £4 on average, which would be equal to almost $300 and $19.90 per votes, right? So that's a lot. I mean, the comparisons aren't perfect. These are differently sized electorates and so on and so forth. And obviously, like, adjusting for inflation over that long period of time is an inexact science. So, many caveats, but it's a totally different order of magnitude of efficacy from what I find in mid-20th century Minas Gerais. In the contemporary US, the best estimates of the efficacy of campaign spending suggest that the most effective way of buying votes, which is door-to-door canvassing, still gets you only about one vote for every $47 spent today. That comes from work by Green and Gerber. And moreover, general campaign expenditures, right, which include television ads and other activities, the estimates are that results in about one vote for every $145 spent, right? So, looking at these comparisons, both historical and contemporary, $14 per vote is pretty good. It suggests that spending money on vote brokers during this period of time was an effective way to mobilize voters. I'm not saying that it was ethical. I'm just saying that it was effective from the vantage point of the politician. What this does imply for me is that the high returns to spending indicate that Campanema's vote brokers were indeed exerting significant effort on his behalf, and that the mechanism of accountability, right, accountability of the vote brokers to Campanema, that mechanism of accountability appears to be reputation building, right? They're really trying to build a reputation for efficacy with Campanema, so in future elections he'll go back to them and spend resources in their bases. All right. So just in terms of conclusions, Brazil during this period of time is often characterized as, relatively speaking, being a situation where there's party weakness. I think that's overdrawn. In fact, Campanema is almost exclusively going to PSD, municipal directorates, and PSD mayoral candidates as his broker. So party is serving a role here. But it is the truth that the brokers aren't really sort of making their way up the party ladder. It doesn't seem to be, at least from the archival record, that they are being punished or benefited after the election in terms of promotions within the party or in terms of explicit punishments. Rather, the benefit or the punishment that they're getting after the election is the future allocation of resources by the politician. And in these contexts, even if there aren't these sort of formal punishments or benefits being allocated by a party, brokers can still serve as effective intermediaries for their patrons, right? And I would argue that there are two factors that contributed to the efficacy of brokers here. One was clear performance metrics, which were these vote counts at the municipal level, right? Under the old cedula bolsa system, vote counts at the municipal level were a pretty unambiguous measure of the effectiveness of the vote broker, and clearly that improved accountability. Moreover, long-term political careers are essential, right? Campanema was not a short-term politician. Anybody who was a broker doing business with him in Minas Gerais during this period in time knew that he was a guy who was here to stay, right? So if you cultivated a good relationship with him, it was likely that you were going to see the fruits of that, the benefits of that in the future, right? So in scenarios where individual politicians have long-term political careers and brokers know that they do, then you're likely to see these reputational dynamics which produce accountability. So it was the combination of these two things that generated reputational accountability. And in terms of thinking about sort of the implications of this work for other settings, right? Settings outside of Minas Gerais, but settings outside of Brazil more generally, I think it's in particular polities with political dynasties where we're likely to see similar types of dynamics, right? Because in settings where you have political dynasties, reputations are transmitted intergenerationally, right, from father to son or father to daughter and so on and so forth. So you're going to have really long-term political careers that can be longer than the life even of an individual politician, right? And so in those settings, these types of accountability dynamics where brokers are accountable not just to the particular politician, but to the dynasty that he or she represents, those are fruitful settings to find these types of findings. So with that, I will finish my presentation, and I'd love to hear your questions and comments. Let me stop the share.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel, for this great presentation, and the paper is also really good and exciting. Open up for a lot of questions. Então, para o pessoal da plateia, a gente vai abrir para questões. Como o professor Rogério já chamou atenção pelo chat, vocês podem mandar as questões por escrito na partezinha aí do Zoom, do Q&A, ou podem levantar a mão e levantar a mão aqui, né, também pelo botãozinho do Zoom, que a gente chama e abre o microfone caso vocês queiram fazer a pergunta oralmente. Para ir deixando todo mundo preparado para fazer uma questão e para enfim, colocar o bloco na rua, eu vou começar fazendo uma questão para o Daniel, e aí vocês podem ir mandando que eu faço na sequência, eu leio as questões que vocês mandaram pelo Q&A ou abro o microfone para vocês, tá bom? Bom, tem uma parte do texto, Daniel, em que você argumenta que políticos dispõem de muitos recursos, políticos que dispõem de muitos recursos e têm ampla experiência política e ambições futuras, como o próprio Campanema, são os que mais se beneficiam da cédula avulsa, certo? Então, eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho mais sobre qual é o impacto da introdução da cédula oficial, do voto de fato secreto, e quais também são as opções para os políticos que não têm as mesmas características que o Gustavo Campanema, então que não dispõem desses amplos recursos e não tem nem uma experiência política mais longa e nem pelo menos uma noção de que terão uma vida longa na política, especialmente nacional. Então, eu queria que você discutisse um pouco isso do impacto da introdução da cédula oficial e também sobre como políticos com menor acesso, como que eles menor acesso a recursos, como eles vão se comportar em relação aos brokers? Qual que é o tipo de relação que você espera, ou que tipo de lições a gente pode tirar do seu trabalho para pensar políticos de menor relevância, menor calibre, menor impacto? Essa é a primeira pergunta para colocar o bloco na rua, e depois eu vou chamar a Thelma para fazer a pergunta dela.
Perfect. Thanks, Neil. That's a terrific question. I should say that the question of impact, if one is really interested in that, the impact of the cédula oficial is treated in a lot of detail in the AJPS paper, which is ballot reform as suffrage restriction. That in fact is the entire focus of that paper. And let me sort of summarize the impact. The focus of that impact is the focus of that paper is its impact for voters and political representation, right? And the impact was really enormous, and the impact was quite clearly disenfranchisement. So the introduction of the cédula oficial led to an enormous amount of wasted votes, blank and null votes, that were heavily concentrated in the municipalities of Brazil with the highest levels of illiteracy. And that was completely by design. It was completely intentional. It was an attack by the UDN, which was a right-wing party, of course, as many of you know, during this period of time, which was more ideological than the PSD, and which felt that it didn't control the countryside and didn't control these networks of brokers to the same extent as the PSD. Of course, they had their own brokers in many states in Brazil, but they felt that they were at a relative disadvantage. Some of their leadership was more based in Rio de Janeiro and based more in Sao Paulo, and they had more of an urban outlook. They viewed themselves as white-collar intellectuals and lawyers, and so they very explicitly, and I can say this without a shadow of a doubt, they very explicitly advocated for the cédula oficial as a mechanism for making it impossible for illiterates to vote. There's a very extensive record of this in parliamentary debates during this period of time, which is discussed both in the 2019 AJPS article and given more focus in the CPS article, that Camilo and I published. So please, if you're interested in that question, look at those two articles. So the cédula oficial had a big effect in terms of restricting the franchise and therefore reducing the clientele of a lot of these brokers in the countryside. It was completely anticipated, and it was desired both by the politicians who were pushing it, as well as some key figures in the electoral justice system itself, including the president of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal during that period of time. Now, of course, politicians, especially in the PSD, pushed against it for precisely this reason, right? Because it was their clientele which was being disenfranchised, they wouldn't be able to benefit from these types of clientelistic networks to the same extent. So I'm not saying that the UDN was the only the only enemies of full-fledged democracy here. They were clearly the enemies of an expansive franchise, right? They just said that they were enforcing the Constitution because illiterates shouldn't have been voting anyway. But the PSD at the same time, while they were pushing against the cédula oficial because they viewed it as restricting the franchise, they were also clearly benefiting from the at times coercive and certainly exploitative nature of clientelism and vote brokerage in the countryside, right? So you could view the PSD as kind of being, they were exploitative, Democrats, that they wanted an expansive franchise, and the UDN were kind of moralistic disenfranchisers, right? They were highly moralistic and they were critical of vote brokerage, there's no question about that. But they also wanted a very narrow electorate, which was constituted by fairly wealthy and well-educated Brazilians, which would not extend to many areas of the countryside. So that was what happened. That was the debate. And frankly, a lot of the null and blank voting that you see during the period of the military government in the 60s and the 70s, and even into the early 80s and 90s, I think needs to be interpreted as difficulty associated with voters who have low levels of education dealing with this cédula oficial system. You just see a very clear skyrocketing of blank and null votes in federal deputy elections after the introduction of the cédula oficial. And that's before the military government takes power. Right? People have historically attributed that to sort of votes against military government, but that was wrong, right? That explosion in blank and null votes concentrated in areas of high levels of illiteracy happened before the military government took power, right? The military government just extended the scope of the cédula oficial, so it wasn't surprising that you would see some continuity there, right? So I do think in terms of thinking about the politicians, the paper with Danilo and I actually focuses more specifically on this, the question of who wins and loses from the introduction of the cédula oficial. Clearly, it's people like Campanema who lose the most, right? And this paper really shows that he fought hard against it. And once it went through, he abandoned the Chamber of Deputies entirely and ran in the Senate. The Senate already had the cédula oficial; it had it since 1956. So kind of once he lost that advantage in the chamber, he said forget about it, and his political career was over pretty soon thereafter. So I do think politicians like this lost. I think more quote unquote populist politicians who are more effective in using the radio, more effective in using what were then modern means of communication in more populated areas had a clear relative advantage, right? Those were clearly the individuals who should have benefited from this reform. So I think I think the issue is, were you savvy about technology? Are you the type of politician who is good on the radio? Are you the type of politician? There was very little TV during this period of time in many places, but in urban areas, you started to get the advent of some of that. Are you somebody who is good in these modern means of communication? If so, you were at a relative advantage through ending this system of cobbling together small amounts of votes in these tiny little municipalities, and it made more sense for you to go attack the major media centers and the major vote blocks in places like Belo Horizonte or the big cities, right? That's not something that Campanema and Campanema type politicians did at all, right? He cobbled together his votes in many different, really smaller municipalities through these types of exchanges. That type of strategy should have become less effective as a consequence of the cédula oficial.
Ótimo, Daniel. Só follow-up. Você menciona que o Campanema foi reeleito 6 vezes, né? Mas a gente sabe que em algumas eleições ele não ficou no topo da lista do partido em Minas. Pelo contrário, ele ficou no fim da lista, né? Ele correu o risco de não ser reeleito em algumas dessas 6 reeleições. E aí, o que eu achei curioso, pensando sobre isso, qual teria sido o destino do Campanema se ele não fosse tão organizado, meticuloso e passasse por esse processo de aprendizado com a atuação dos brokers? Será que, pelo estilo de político que ele era e o tipo de penetração e de mobilização de eleitores que ele tinha, ele sem esse processo organizado, mesmo tendo muitos recursos disponíveis e sendo uma figura importante no partido, será que ele existiria a possibilidade dele ficar para baixo do corte e não conseguir ter sido eleito? E eu aproveito e emendo outra pequena pergunta, que é um pouco sobre o papel do Campanema também como uma liderança partidária, ou como uma figura importante do partido em Minas, e como você imagina que isso poderia afetar a atuação dele, já que, ao mesmo tempo que ele tinha que lutar para ser eleito, ele também tinha que se preocupar com o partido como um todo para avançar sua carreira de forma mais ampla e não simplesmente se reeleger.
Those are both great questions. To answer the first question, without the really amazing organization that he had in his campaign, would he have been as effective? Absolutely not. I mean, one of the things that really struck me going through his archives was just how methodical he was in terms of recording where he had sent his ballots, how much he had spent in the production of his ballots, where he was getting his votes from. I mean, it was crazy. Like, he was counting down to the vote. Like, you are absolutely right in saying that his wins or losses were very, very tight, but so was his measurement, right? I mean, that is in part, I think, why he's able to hold these brokers to account the way that he was, because he knew, like, things were potentially on a razor edge, especially if you're dealing with so many small municipalities. You're only getting a couple of hundred votes here and there. You really have to make sure that your guys are working. If he wasn't so organized, I don't see how he could have done what I presented in this paper, right? If he wasn't as organized, he would not have been able to reallocate his campaign expenditures in a way that was optimally efficient from his vantage point, right? So he ends up, winning election and being able to get reelected because he's sending his money to the places with the highest returns. And if he didn't have careful measurement of what people's returns were and what those returns were relative to his expectations and his investments, then I don't think he would have been able to do that. So my first answer to your question is no. I think it takes, it took some of this organization. Now, you may say that has implications for some external validity here. I'm not going to argue that Campanema is the typical politician, right? He was exceptional at what he did, as sort of, a rural politician and exploiting vote brokers. Not everybody was as good as him in doing what he did. But I do think that almost certainly there's many politicians who tried and had similarly long careers and probably were able to generate some accountability, if not the degree of accountability that the brokers had to Campanema. The other question about Campanema that rose in the question is his relationship to the PSD and how is that relevant? I do think it was relevant, right? His position as a party leader. And I think it was relevant in the sense that it did kind of limit the set of vote brokers that he was potentially looking at. This was still kind of a setting where there was party discipline in the sense that he was working within the party, okay? And that makes sense because, he's a major figure within the PSD. So when he's looking at his brokers, he's looking at PSD mayoral candidates, he's looking at the PSD party directorates and the party directorate presidents, right? He's not trying to buy off like wavering UDN heads or wavering politicians from other political parties. He's doing it within the party. Now, if we took this analysis and we were able to extend it to other states, we were doing this with brokers in Pernambuco, for instance, during sort of the heyday of coronelismo there. I don't expect we would find that. I think we would find a lot more crossing of party lines where the politicians are trying to buy off brokers and brokers are potentially changing their shirts and their allegiances, okay? I think that doesn't happen here in Minas Gerais under Campanema, in part because of precisely what was asked in this question, his position within the PSD. So I think in other settings, politicians probably would have had even more flexibility in choosing who their brokers were. So this isn't a case, I think, of outright party weakness, but it's also not a case of, you know, like a machine party where all the benefits and costs are being controlled by the machine, like you would have found in Mexico under the PRI, for instance, right? So it's a very different setting than that one. So that was the first question about Campanema. Daniel, remind me, what was the second half?
It was exactly that. You answered like the first part and the second part about the leadership position of Campanema, and we also talked a little bit about like the chances that he would have if he wasn't able to draw on these resources in terms of the position on the list. So you answered both.
Okay, great.
Okay. So, eu vou abrir agora, então, o microfone da Thelma para ela colocar a pergunta dela. Ou acho que a Thelma mesmo consegue abrir. Thelma, pode falar, por favor.
Está me ouvindo?
Sim.
Sim. Oi, meu nome é Thelma, sou doutoranda no departamento e atualmente eu faço uma pesquisa, estou escrevendo, na verdade, a tese no processo infinito de escrever, que é justamente sobre brokers e mandatos de vereadores em São Paulo, e o tema da economia política da brokerage me é muito caro, né? Então, em primeiro lugar, parabéns pela pesquisa, né, e para o time que tornou esse acesso a esses dados, esse material possível. É sempre bom dar um pouco de carne e osso, né, porque às vezes parece tão distante, dependendo do jeito, do método que se faz pesquisa, e você foi além, criando um modelo de gasto de campanha para isso, que foi um uso muito interessante para o material. Dito isso, eu tenho algumas provocações que no final eu acho que estão preocupadas com how suitable, né? Assim, com a aplicabilidade do modelo para entender os dias de hoje e com também o alcance da explicação. Porque se eu entendi o caminho teórico que você desenvolveu no paper, a sua preocupação é também engajar os dados de 1960 com a literatura atual sobre brokerage, né? Mas a gente fica um pouco sem entender esse link, né? Tem um mapeamento da literatura atual e daí apresenta os dados de 1960. A gente é um pouco deixado com uma incógnita de como atualizar o modelo para os dias de hoje. Queria te ouvir de como você considera outras variáveis. Então, eu vou sugerir algumas, assim. Desde 1960, né, assim, a gente hoje é 80% urbanizado. Na realidade, rural é a minoria no país. Além do voto secreto das instituições eleitorais que exercem controle sobre isso, a gente teve um aumento da fragmentação e da competição partidária, um aumento incrível das instâncias participativas de todo tipo, né, conselhos e tudo, universalização de políticas em muitas áreas, um cash transfer program que não deixou intermediários, né, mediando isso, como foi, por exemplo, no México, um caso em que o clientelismo explica que a literatura do clientelismo tem que olhar, enfim, só para citar algumas mudanças. E para provocar um pouco mais, talvez a gente, incluindo essas variáveis todas, chegue numa conclusão que a partir dessa lente do clientelismo de partida seja muito difícil assim entender o Brasil atual, né? Eu não estou questionando o modelo que você criou para explicar 1960, mas pensando como atualizá-lo, né? E preocupado também porque a literatura da Rational Choice, que estuda clientelismo, frequentemente estuda cidades do semiárido e faz conclusões para o Brasil inteiro. E I'm afraid to say que talvez isso represente um cenário muito restrito, muito pequeno do Brasil, nesse sentido que eu falo sobre ser honesto sobre o escopo, né, do que Rational Choice está explicando do clientelismo. E talvez esses 30% não sejam aqueles que sejam realmente significativos para a gente entender como que essa brokerage estrutura vínculos locais até entender o governo federal, né? Para tornar um pouco tangível, assim, talvez o que eu estou dizendo, a gente pensar junto como essas variáveis podiam ser atualizadas para o modelo, porque eu realmente achei muito interessante essa forma de modelar, pensando no caso de São Paulo. Tem uma unidade intermediária, que não são os partidos, uma unidade meso-level, talvez a gente possa dizer, que são os mandatos. Então, brokers estão vinculados a vereadores, a partir de uma unidade que são mandatos. E por que existe essa estrutura intermediária, essa informação que você coloca como premissa para entender o problema do selection problem? Ela é atenuada, porque o mandato cria mais informações sobre quem são os brokers, né? E brokers são recrutados porque eles são pessoas que têm uma liderança local, participam em conselhos participativos, e frequentemente o que eles estão fazendo nesses conselhos compete com o objetivo de aumentar a constituição do mandato. Os vereadores sabem disso, é evidente que isso é um risco, porque se eles saírem, eles levam os vínculos consigo. Então, compete com o objetivo de aumentar a constituição, né, do mandato. Mas eu não diria que isso é uma questão de controle e punishment, como essa gramática da Rational Choice sugere, porque é mais uma questão de gerenciar esse risco, sabe? Não sei. E aí existe uma tal estruturação do sistema, ou uma diferença de como o sistema está estruturado, que a linguagem de punir brokers, que seriam desviantes, também não se aplica, porque eles podem facilmente ir para outros políticos, né? Enfim, queria um pouco te ouvir sobre essas questões. E um dado que eu não sei se ajuda a gente a pensar em que medida a fragmentação partidária, o aumento da competição mudou um pouco, é que o cálculo médio do voto hoje no município, para eleições municipais, eu não sei estadual e federal, e também não sei fazer essa atualização para essa taxa do dólar maluca que está, não sei quanto hoje. Seria R$100 em média por voto municipal. Acho que é um pouco essa provocação, assim, e pensar em como a gente pode se nutrir também de uma perspectiva multidisciplinar para olhar para esse assunto.
Great. Okay. So that's a great question, and really thoughtful, and I really appreciate the engagement and the provocation. You know, the first part of the question and kind of the major component of it is, you know, how do we extend the theoretical framework, or how do we think about these relationships between brokers and politicians outside of the context of, say, you know, the mid-20th century rural Brazil under the candidate printed ballot system, which was not secret. And I would say, you know, sort of the paper is able to evaluate some general arguments which are made in the literature on brokerage, which are applied to secret ballot systems, which are operative today, obviously in countries around the world. But it's kind of able to do it, I think, in the equivalent of a political vacuum, which is to say, like a very clean environment where the mechanisms of accountability were fairly straightforward. And that's I think both a virtue and a limitation. Like it's empirically a virtue. It is somewhat of a limitation, as you suggest, when you would want to extend it to contemporary settings where electorates are much larger, much much more urban, and there's sort of overlapping jurisdictions between brokers and so on and so forth. What I will say is, the basic logic of monitoring and reputation is a general one and should apply in other places and settings. But I think, this paper is able to establish it as cleanly as it is because of the nature of electoral technology. It was really simple to know if somebody was effective or not in bringing out votes for you at the municipal level, because there was really no way for individuals to vote for you unless that person distributed the ballots and was taking responsibility for the transportation, in many cases, of voters to the polls, right? Whereas in a contemporary setting, in Brazil or elsewhere, and under the secret ballot, right, as a politician, you're going to get some chunk of votes because of ideological affinity, because of whatever public works that you've allocated to the particular area in the past. And that might not have anything to do with the effort that the broker is expending or what they're doing. And so sort of differentiating the returns to the broker's effort and the other things that you are doing as a candidate is much harder in a contemporary secret ballot setting than in the the mid-20th century non-secret ballot setting that I study in this paper. I completely recognize that, but I think the virtue of the paper is it's able to test in a very, I think, clean way the central component of a learning argument of politicians' relationships to vote brokers. I think thinking forward to ways in which this model can or should be complicated or made more nuanced for contemporary settings, I think, like, in these small municipalities in rural parts of the country, for somebody like Campanema, there was basically one broker per municipality for him to go to, right? Especially since he was only going to go with the PSD municipal directorate president, or he was only going to go with the PSD mayoral candidate, and sometimes those were the same person. So basically, he had a choice between broker or municipality. They were the same thing, right? There was an identity between the broker and the municipality, right? In a contemporary setting with, especially with larger cities, right? There's going to be a much wider set of choice for politicians in any given area, right? Many brokers that they could potentially choose from. There's also going to be a real challenge with accountability that I think your comments suggest, which is there's something that economists, industrial organization would call a team production problem, right? Whereas if you have a certain area which is being serviced by multiple brokers at the same time, right? It's hard for you as the politician to know, even if you look at something like precinct level results, it's hard for you to know which broker is responsible for your positive vote count. And brokers are going to know that, right? And so it might be harder to induce effort in a very broker-rich environment where it's hard to discern who is responsible for the votes and who is not responsible for the votes, right? So that's one way I would address your question, but that's all keeping it within Thelma, the rational choice framework, right? It's basically just complicating the framework that I've already presented. In terms of thinking about clientelism and brokerage and non-rational choice mechanisms, I mean, there are a lot of those out there in the literature. I'm sure you're familiar with them. There's the really interesting work by Finan and Schechter in others looking at norms of reciprocity. You know, the suggestion is that, you know, one of the things that what brokers are doing is they're identifying citizens that hold reciprocal norms, right? So this comes out of work they did in rural Paraguay. What keeps the clients of brokers with them and voting the way that they direct is just that these particular individuals have exogenously given norms of reciprocity. When somebody gives them something, they feel that they need to reciprocate, and they do that at the ballot box. I mean, I think that, you know, that's plausible. You know, that's all well and good. That, you know, that's kind of a non-rational choice framework on clientelism, but that's in no way inconsistent with my framework, for instance, like, because my framework is a story about the relationship between politicians and brokers, not a story about the relationship between brokers and voters. So, you know, even if brokers are doing precisely that, you know, what Fanon and Schechter suggest, and it's like a semi-rational or a non-rational relationship, some brokers are presumably better at that than others, and some are better at identifying those reciprocal voters than others. And politicians should still be interested in identifying those brokers that are most effective. And so I'm not sure that I see an incompatibility here, right? I mean, I think some of these theories can be layered on top of one another.
Eu posso só fazer um comentário, porque eu acho que a gente não está só literalmente falando língua diferente, mas metaforicamente também. Essa estrutura de brokerage com penetração territorial ainda existe. É assim que mandatos se estruturam em todas as cidades, inclusive urbanas. Então, existe um número de assessores que são formalmente contratados, existe um esquema de rachadinha pelo qual se contratam outros, até atingir uma capilaridade territorial suficiente para atingir o eleitor. O político não está agindo, fazendo campanha sozinho porque é um contexto urbano, não é essa contraposição que eu estou fazendo. Essa estrutura ainda existe. E ela é territorializada de tal maneira que é possível identificar quantos votos cada broker traz. A minha questão é que, porque o mandato é uma estrutura meso-level, existem mais informações para o problema de como se contrata, para essa simetria que você coloca ao desenhar o modelo como premissa. É um pouco esse ponto.
But the challenge, of course, always with the secret vote is you never know exactly how many votes any of these brokers are mobilizing, you know, under a secret vote system, irrespective of how fine-grained the structure of brokerage is. So there always is this fundamental informational asymmetry there, right? Because voters can never make a credible commitment. They can never make a credible statement ex post that I voted the way that I voted because of my particular relationship with this broker. So there's always going to be some type of fundamental informational asymmetry there that the politician is going to need to or going to want to overcome vis-a-vis his brokers. You know, I fully accept that it's probably more fine-grained and that there's a variety of mechanisms for compensation, you know, that may be more or less formal that would make that possible. But I do think that informational asymmetry and learning about efficacy is always going to be an issue. How could it not with the secret vote? You just
eu não digo que não seja um problema, existe sempre uma simetria. Mas dada essa estrutura, a nossa estrutura de eleições em que no meio da eleição municipal se tem uma estadual, existe o que você colocou no artigo que você conhece como dobradas. Essa estrutura dos vereadores locais fazem campanha para deputados estaduais e federais. Nesse momento dessas campanhas intermediárias, que ele reúne, agrupa quem é o mandato, quem são os apoiadores, eles conseguem medir mais ou menos quantas pessoas cada broker traz. Não quer dizer que isso vai ser exatamente a quantidade de votos. É uma medida, porque na campanha municipal seguinte, ele consegue mensurar o quanto distribui de recurso, e não é para comprar voto, é para contratar staff de campanha.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. That's fine, right? That's a good point. And you know what? I mean, I would even say, I would say, you know, from the vantage point of Campanema and the mid 1950s, mid 1960s, it might have been going to the same thing. I don't know, you know, based on this paper, what the money was actually spent on, right? So, you know, were the brokers taking this money that they were given and, you know, literally purchasing voters by, you know, providing them with food and drink and other things? I don't think so. Like most of the money, almost surely based on what I saw in the archives, most of the money was going for transportation expenses. So the brokers were saying like, you know, we're spending a lot of money on gas and, you know, renting trucks and sort of moving voters from place to place. So I don't doubt then or now that in a lot of these exchanges, the money is not going directly into the pockets of voters, right? By no stretch of the imagination. I think that, you know, to the extent that that's happening at all, that's a very small percentage. I think a lot of it indeed is going into the local infrastructure of whoever the broker or brokers are. So yeah, I want to make that clear. But the broker is still benefiting from that, right? So the way that the model is envisioning it is, you know, the bigger the investments that the higher level politician, the federal deputy, is making into his local machine, you know, the larger the cut that he is able to take from that, right? So essentially, brokers like to have more investments in their machines rather than less investments in their machines. That's sort of the underlying mechanism of accountability. If you didn't have that, then they wouldn't care. But I take your point on that. That's a good point. And I agree actually completely.
Obrigado, Thelma e Daniel. Nós temos mais algumas perguntas aqui. O professor Bruno Speck tinha colocado 2 perguntas, mas ele diz que a primeira pergunta já foi respondida. Então, ele colocou a segunda pergunta da seguinte forma. Notei na base de dados que, em 1962, houve pagamentos em 53 municípios, com um broker em cada. Ok. Achei interessante que o total de votos desses municípios com investimento é 1.200 votos. Em outros municípios onde Capanema não pagou, ele teve 5.300 votos. Então, o brokerage era responsável somente por uma pequena, que pode ser decisiva, parte da votação. Não? É isso mesmo? E eu vou juntar com uma pergunta que o Rodney Amador mandou aqui também no Q&A. Rodney comenta. No texto, o senhor comenta que alguns destes brokers eram prefeitos de cidades mineiras e que eles eram recompensados de acordo com seu desempenho de uma campanha para outra. Existe alguma evidência de que essas relações permaneciam para além do momento eleitoral registrado nesses documentos? Algo como o apoio de Capanema nas eleições municipais ou o direcionamento de recursos do Estado para essas cidades, do tipo Pork Barrel. E vale só destacar que o Rodney vem estudando a atuação em São Paulo do... Eita, gente, esqueci o nome.
Ademar de Barros.
Do Ademar de Barros, isso. Então, o Rodney está muito interessado nesse tema também, pensando no trabalho do Ademar de Barros em São Paulo. Acho que é isso. Depois eu passo para mais algumas perguntas que surgiram.
Perfect. So the first question is, I think that, you know, if you look at the tables, I don't recall if they were in the main paper or the appendix. Like the appendix makes sort of clear what the distribution of the votes looked like, across the municipalities with brokers and non-brokers, and just, percentage-wise, Campanema was getting a very large percentage of his votes from the broker-dominated municipalities, and even some of the rare cases where he was getting votes in municipalities that I didn't list as having payoffs in the paper. In some of those cases, there was still something else going on. There was still like, typically there was some public work being performed that he was associated with, and sort of the vote broker there was bringing out the vote on his behalf. I couldn't have that measured as a payoff for my perspective, because he wasn't, the broker wasn't receiving money, campaign expenditures, the way that the others were. But that was still, I mean, it's very, very clear that that's the major driver of votes during this period of time. The other point, sorry, Daniel, can you reformulate the second question about energy borrowing?
Okay, sure. So, o Rodney está perguntando, ele comenta que os brokers eram normalmente prefeitos de cidades mineiras, né? Então,
yeah, that's for sure.
chama atenção para o fato de eles serem prefeitos ou figuras relevantes no município. Tá. E que eles eram recompensados de acordo com o seu desempenho de uma campanha para outra.
Yeah.
O que o Rodney quer saber é se existe alguma evidência de que as relações, você já falou um pouco isso na resposta anterior, mas se existe alguma evidência de que essa relação entre o broker e o Campanema, ou enfim, o político de forma geral, permaneceriam para além do momento eleitoral que você encontrou nos documentos. Então, meio que um pouco o que acontece entre uma eleição e outra, ainda mais, acho que levando em consideração que o Campanema é uma figura relevante na política nacional e no partido.
That's a great question, and it's sort of it's a relevant question for the literature too. Yeah, so it's a great question. So one of the things that I'll tell you what is in the archive and what isn't in the archive, at least in that sort of electoral archive, right? There may be other things there. What is there, which is really quite interesting, is sort of the reports that come in from some of these brokers after the election, right? Letters or telegrams to Campanema, describing their performance. Some of them are really ashamed. It's kind of interesting to see, meu prestigio político é muito baixo. Like, you have people who are like ashamed that they did such a bad job in bringing out the vote. You can see that they're really sort of attached to this, and there's others, who did well, who are happy to take all of the credit for it. Some people who didn't do as well as they expected, will blame like the duplicity of whatever rival was trying to get the votes in that particular area. But it's clear, like, they knew that they were being watched, and that they were expected to give a statement of accounts after the election. But that is immediately after the election. What I don't know, is I think what this question is going to, which is, 7 or 8 months after the election, a year after the election, what is the general relationship between these mayors and Campanema, and are they interacting with one another, and if so, how, and what are the favors that are being exchanged at that point in time? That's a really good question. It's a good question in part because there's a sort of theoretical literature. Simeon Nichter in particular, who works on these issues of clientelism, sort of emphasizes, at least in the relationship between brokers and voters, the importance of non-electoral communication and exchange in cementing brokerage relationships. So it's entirely plausible that might be relevant for the relationship between politicians and brokers as well. I don't know. What I will say, though, is it can't be that those, let's call them midterm, like those interim relationships between brokers and politicians are completely dominant. Because if that was the case, there wouldn't have been this huge wave of activity that we clearly see in the archival record in the short period of time leading up to the election, right? More of those mayors would have been locked in to the politician, the federal deputy with whom they've had this relationship. And you don't see that, right? I mean, you know, in one election cycle, you know, Campanema is sending dozens and dozens and dozens of telegrams to mayors, you know, just, you know, asking them for asking them to support him and whether, you know, they'd be willing to come to an agreement. I just don't think you would have that type of activity, and you wouldn't have these short-term payoffs changing allegiances if that interim relationship was systematically dominant. So there is, you know, there is, I think, a bit of a conflict here. I think those interim relationships surely existed, and they must be prevalent in some cases, and certainly in some states. I don't doubt that. But if they were dominant in here, that doesn't square with what we're seeing Campanema doing on the campaign trail in the few months leading up to the election.
Great, Daniel. Você já tratou um pouco disso, mas o Moacir gostaria de ouvir um pouco mais. Ele quer saber, o Moacir quer saber se seria possível apontar uma ruptura e uma continuidade entre o sistema político eleitoral vigente no período em que o Campanema atuou e o período atual. Então, acho que é um pouco, ele quer saber um pouco mais sobre rupturas e continuidades em termos de lições do seu trabalho, para pensar a comparação do período pré-voto de fato secreto e agora com o voto de fato secreto.
Yeah, so I mean, the easiest thing to talk about is continuity, right? And there's some shocking ones, right? I mean, just in terms of the role, you know, as in Thelma's discussion, and even in, you know, my prior work, the work of Lucas and Elias, the, you know, work of Anderson Frey and others, it's very, very clear that there's continuity in local politicians serving as vote brokers for higher level politicians. You know, even today, or even in the modern era, well after the introduction of the secret vote, we have, you know, quite a few studies, and they're typically centered on mayors, showing that those relationships continue to exist, at least in some contexts, right? Not everywhere, but you know, there's quite a few studies at this point, and so, you know, the role of local politicians in bringing out the vote in these types of elections is I think pretty well appreciated, and so that is clearly a point of continuity. It's lasted, I think, much longer than anybody expected, right? And in spite of the degree of urbanization and socioeconomic modernization, you know, that the country went through from the 1950s through the 1970s, there has been a resilience in this basic form of linkage. And even in states like Minas Gerais, which, you know, are you know, fairly wealthy in various, you know, at least various areas. So I think that's kind of a surprise, but it's really well established in the literature by this point. So ruptures, I you know, in terms of ruptures, these things exist. I just don't think they're anywhere as meaningful as they used to be, electorally speaking, right? I mean, people still draw on mayors, and there's still sort of this, you know, the allocation of campaign resources to lower level politicians and the dobradinha, so on and so forth. Do I think they drive elections and electoral results to the extent that they did during this period of time? Absolutely not. For the reasons that I specified, right? Because it's harder to monitor. The brokers aren't doing nearly as much, right? I mean, having a broker not work for you was a kind of a death sentence for certain types of politicians then, and it's just not today. So, you know, the local level brokers, the way that I see them, they are part of a menu of different strategies, of which you may have many, right? As a politician, they're not necessarily the most effective. They are, part of that menu. There's something that you can invest in and invest less in. Whereas, during the period of time studied in this paper, in that particular context of rural Brazil that I was looking at, I don't want to say that they were the only thing that you could do, but they were probably the central way for you to bring out your vote. So the way that I would explain it simply is, it's a difference in degree, not necessarily a difference in kind, but it is a substantial difference in degree.
Ótimo, Daniel. Obrigado pela resposta. Acho que o Moacir deve ter ficado satisfeito. A gente está chegando no nosso teto, né? O Rogério pode falar melhor, mas normalmente os seminários do departamento vão até 7h30. Talvez eu gostaria, então, de pedir para você concluir falando de duas coisas. Uma, um pouco pensando na competição. Então, acho que o trabalho também leva a gente a repensar o problema da competição do Brasil na Segunda ou na Terceira República. Porque se há não só o investimento, mas uma preocupação de investir os recursos de forma eficiente, isso por si só já é um indicador de que há competição e de que os atores estão super pensando nessa competição e focados em resolver esses problemas da competição de forma eficiente, especialmente com o valor das campanhas subindo muito, né? Então, se você puder falar um pouco mais sobre como você entende a competição nesse período, e pensamento sobre como as mudanças no desempenho de um ano para o outro do Campanema, mas dos candidatos de forma geral, no período, teria a ver também com a mudança na competição, entrada de novos atores. Acho que seria um comentário legal de ouvir você. Um pouco, meio o seu entendimento mesmo sobre o nível de competição naquele momento. E outra pergunta mais para a gente encerrar com um comentário pedagógico, gostaria um pouco que você comentasse o seu esforço de incluir também um modelo formal nesse trabalho, certo? Você poderia ter feito, enfim, colocado as hipóteses e os argumentos, sem necessariamente introduzir, mas você fez esse exercício de fazer um modelo formal bem bacana e acessível, e acho que para os alunos que estão assistindo, pode ser interessante ouvir você falar um pouco sobre a importância desse esforço de incluir o modelo formal no artigo.
Great. Thank you, Neil. I think these are both great questions. Let me just write them down. So the first is competition. The second is why a formal model, and sort of thinking about the value added of that. I think the competition is a really interesting question. I think it's important to appreciate that politicians' understanding of their relative standing was kind of limited during this period of time. Like it was a very data scarce environment, right? Besides the municipal level returns that they were getting, or that they had gotten in the past, they really didn't have any other metric to go on, right? You didn't have sort of broad public opinion polling during this period of time. Certainly not, in an extensive way for federal deputy candidates. So their sense of where they stood relative to other candidates was pretty weak. That was my sense, like reading through the letters and the archives. I mean, in terms of Campanema and his preoccupation with competition, it was very clear that it was a preoccupation with other major figures within the PSD and Minas Gerais, right? So, he was concerned with other PSD politicians, Valadares or others, having deals with particular municipal directorates that he couldn't cut in on, right? So competition meant, some areas of the state that, you know, were in the pockets of other politicians within the PSD. I didn't get a sense that he was thinking at all about the relative strength of other parties versus the PSD. I think he was just going after such small vote chunks. It was, you know, either, you know, the PSD has some appreciable presence, and, you know, there are some number of votes that are not accounted for in these municipalities, and I can go for them or not. I think because Brazil's open list PR system for a state the size of Minas Gerais is so complicated to think through in terms of, you know, the precise likelihood that I'm going to get a seat given my position on the list, and given, you know, the number of seats that are going to go to my list as a function of everybody else's, you know, votes within my party, and then everybody else's votes within all the other parties that are competing. I think because that is such a complicated calculus, he was kind of thinking in a vacuum. How am I doing relative to where I was in the past? And do I have a path forward in municipalities relative to my major rivals within the PSD? So I do think, like, you know, thinking about rational choice in those issues, I think there had to be some simplifying exercise going on there to be able to think about your relative position, and that's how I think it was working, right? You know, you couldn't write down a formal model of you know, equilibrium competition in an open list PR system with you know, 40 or 50 seats available in an electorate the size of Minas Gerais. It's just, it's beyond comprehension, right? Even for those who do math. So I think, you know, there has to be a simplifying schema, and that's what it seems like he was using. In terms of why the formal model, like, let me motivate this a little bit. Like, you know, the formal model, I think, has novel elements to it, but it's also, I hope, you know, the paper is making some more general contributions to the study of political accountability, because formal models of this type, these principal agent models of learning, are very, very general, right? And so I wanted to be able to take kind of what I saw as the core of these principal agent models of political accountability. Similar models have been used to describe the relationship between politicians and the electorate. I've used similar models to describe, you know, corruption within bureaucracies. People use these models all the time for accountability between bureaucrats and elected politicians, the president or the Congress. These are sort of, these principal agent models are a workhorse, and all of them presume to some degree or another that one of the mechanisms of accountability is learning. But there's actually very few papers out there that I think, like this one, have been able to demonstrate as clearly that the learning mechanism is really what's operative here. And so I thought it was important to have a clear formal model, Danilo, that would produce very specific comparative statics, which is very specific predictions, which could then be verified in the data, right? And I think, you know, if the formal model has a virtue in this paper, and I'd like to believe that it does, the virtue is that it is very, very closely tied with the nature of the empirics and the findings of the empirics. Personally, I've never, I've used formal models in lots of papers before, but I've never written a paper where the formal model and the empirics were as closely aligned with one another as for this particular paper. And, you know, it just turned out that way, that the empirics in this paper are, especially because they have those expectations, are really, really closely aligned with some of the logic of principal agent models. So since we use those models a lot, since they're crucial to our understanding of accountability, not just between brokers and politicians, but our understanding of accountability between citizens and their rulers, between bureaucrats and their political masters, politicians, I thought it would be really helpful to have a model and some pretty direct testing of that model.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Great answers. Obrigado, Daniel. Obrigado, público que está assistindo, professores, alunos do departamento, professores e alunos de fora também que tiveram a oportunidade de entrar nessa chamada do Zoom. Não sei se o Rogério quer entrar para finalizar, ou